Today, I'm going to be talking about cost planning. I know that cost planning is potentially the most boring part of cloud engineering. It's something that needs to be talked about. I'm hopefully going to present it in a pretty succinct and informational way, but hopefully this sheds some new light. If you aren't familiar with AWS's new savings plans, I would check the video that's going to be popping up on the top right-hand side of this video for my Intro to Savings Plans video. So if you haven't already seen that, I would recommend going to watch that and coming back, because this video assumes that you have some basic understandings of what savings plans are. So we're going to be going over how to do EC2 cost planning with the new savings plans and how to optimize the most amount you can save with the minimal amount of work. We're also going to look at incorporating spot instances into your infrastructure footprint and the upsides and downsides and some very basic ins and outs of putting that into practice. Being caught up on savings plan, you're probably pretty excited to not have to fight RIs anymore. And when you look at the new savings plan dashboard, you may just be tempted to click whatever it says, and in this case, get your 40% savings and be on with it. This is pretty tempting, and I think the tooling here is actually really nice. But these savings plans recommendations are usually pretty general to your overall footprint. They don't take into account special considerations certain instances have, and they potentially leave a lot of money on the table and potential percentage of savings. Let's look at a really simple example. You have a simple orchestration cluster. You also have a few nodes of a business intelligence big data cluster, and then you have some supporting Jenkins and RabbitMQ resources. Your total on-demand cost comes out to about $4,300 a month. If we look at the instance count percentage of these instances in our AWS account, we have, about 70% C5s, 23% some R5s, and then that one M5 instance that makes about 7% of your account. But if we look at the price breakdown, we actually see that those R5 instances, those three R5 instances, actually account for over 50% of our on-demand cost per hour. And then a remaining 40% or over 40% goes to those C5 instances, and that one M5 instance only accounts for about 3% of our total costs. But if we were to look at some savings plans, and let's assume theoretically that we're just going to put all of our instances in a savings plan. So if we start with our on-demand price of $4,300, and we were just to do an all-upfront compute 3-year, it would be about $1,900 a month, amortized over the course of the 3 years, and that would be a 55% savings. A compute 1-year plan would be about 32% savings per month. And then if we were to do no upfront, we would get about 5% less. And if we were to do compute 3-year no upfront, we'd get about 50% savings, and a compute 1-year no upfront would be about 27% savings. It's important to note that the difference between all upfront and no upfront is about 5% across the board. And I didn't include partial upfront here, but you can just kind of usually split the difference between all upfront and no upfront. Now, if we look at EC2 savings plans, we see that we now have a max savings of 62% for 3-year all upfront, and our 1-year all upfront is 41%. If we look at a 3-year no upfront and 1-year no upfront for EC2 plans, you can once again subtract about 5%. Based on this information, the rest of the numbers I'm going to give are usually going to be the all upfront, but you can remove the 5% off those numbers if you're planning on doing no upfront. Usually the decision to make no upfront, all upfront, or partial upfront is usually a business decision, not necessarily an engineering decision. It's, whose signatures do you have to get to sign that really big check for a potentially 3-year upfront savings plan. So one really important thing to note is the difference between the 1-year and the 3-year savings plans. Here in the blue, we have our on-demand price. In the red, we have a compute 3-year savings plan. In the yellow, we have a 1-year savings plan. And this is calculating the cost over 12, 24, and 36-month intervals. Now, the main thing I want to highlight here, besides just the raw savings over time that you'll get by using a savings plan, is that across the board, about 2 years of the 1-year savings plan accounts for almost the same cost of just buying a 3-year savings plan. A lot of people are confused why it's 1 year and 3 year and there's no 2 year. It is kind of a form of price anchoring that AWS does here, but understand that a lot of times the commitment isn't necessarily 3 years. The commitment to get the better savings is actually only 2 years, because if you do 1-year plans for multiple years in a row, once you have done it twice, you would have been better off just buying the 3-year plan. So that's just something to take in mind as you're planning. If you can really hunker down and get that 3-year plan, it's potentially a lot more savings if you're planning on using it for more than 2 years. If we look back at our simple account, what can we do here with savings plans? If we look at our cost breakdown and we have R5 4x large instances accounting for over 50% of our total cost. Although we can come in here and just be lazy and we can do our compute all up front and save, a bit over 50%, or take whatever the AWS Savings Plan dashboard says. If we do a little bit more work here and we talk to our BI team and, we realize these R5 instances are pretty new in AWS, and we talk to our BI team, we decide we're going to at least have this cluster for, 2 to 3 years. We don't plan to change this instance type. If anything, we'll make it bigger in the future, and we don't plan to change regions. And we also get sign off from an executive, potentially to write that big check. We can make our business intelligence cluster EC2 3-year all up front to get that, over 60% savings. And then, genuinely, we can just take everything else and we can just do compute 3-year no up front, and we can save our 50% off the rest of the instances. And this brings our total savings down 57%. We still do have lock into AWS for 3 years, and those EC2 savings plans for the BI cluster is still going to be locked in for R5 types, but we're saving 57%. If we look back to the dashboard, the savings plan that AWS would recommend would probably only be about 40-ish%. So as long as we plan to be growing still, the only true thing that we have to plan for is that our business intelligence cluster isn't going to change and that we're going to be growing with our compute footprint. And if we wanted to be even less lock-in for our compute resources, we can do compute 1 year with no upfront, right? We're just locking into this amount of compute workload that's not the BI cluster for 1 year, and we're still saving 45%, which should be a little bit more than what the savings plan dashboard is going to be recommending. So that was a really simple AWS account. If your account looks that simple, RI purchases probably weren't even that hard, but most of us don't have an account that's simple. Most of us looks more something like this, where we have, we have a larger container orchestration cluster with workers of different sizes. We have a massive big data footprint with different types of BI clusters. We have dev clusters. We have instances with people's names on them. We have instances labeled old and test, and a lot of instances that we don't know what the lifetime is going to be. Once again, we could go to the AWS dashboard. It's probably going to take about 80% of these. It's going to, give you a range. It's going to say you can save about 40%. You can click that. But once again, we can go back and look at our savings plans for this of different type. So this footprint has an on-demand cost of about $30,000, almost $31,000. If we do EC2 savings plan for every single instance for 3 years, it's savings 63%. For 1 year, all up front, it's 41%. These are about the same percentages off as we saw on our last account. And the same thing for compute. So compute 3 years, all up front, 56% off. And compute 1 year, all up front, 32% off. So what can we do with this information? If we look back at our account and we look at the instance distribution, we have a whole bunch of different random instances. We have some T2s, we have some R5s, we have some newer R5Ns, we have some older instances. There's quite a range. If we once again look at the cost breakdown of these instances per hour, we see a completely different story. We see R5N 12x larges making up over 50% of our overall costs, so that's over $15,000 a month just on those R5N instances. And then we have C5s and R5s making up a majority of everything else, and all those random other instance sizes and those T3s are all a very small percentage of the overall pie. So just like before, we can isolate some core cost centers of some instances that are going to be around for the next few years. We don't plan to change regions and probably are pretty locked into the instance type. Once again, our BI big data clusters and our cluster controllers in this case are two different areas that are newer instances and most likely won't require much change in the next bit of time. If not, they're just going to grow larger. And of course, you're going to have to coordinate the team and get all up front, but this is where you're going to get a maximum amount of your savings for your overall account. And then you can throw pretty much everything else that you plan to stay around and all up front. Or in this case, you can even look at the AWS dashboard and see what it recommends for the rest of these. You may even have more dynamic workloads here. In this case, I'm just going to go with compute 3-year all up front for the rest of these, and everything in white, we're just going to leave on demand. We don't plan to have these for very long, so we'll just leave these on demand. In this case, we'll get a savings about 58%. Now that's once again just a really rough breakdown of things that you can do with savings plans if you just spend a little bit of time looking at it. Now I know that this account layout is still pretty naive for a lot of your workloads and your AWS footprints. I'm sure most of your footprints are a lot more dynamic, with auto-scaling groups coming in and out, with dev resources getting built and tested upon and iterated upon, and people leaving things running. And that's where there's true power in the AWS Savings Plan dashboard, but you can use that after you try to isolate your core cost center for things that you can truly plan for multiple years in advance, because most accounts do have some core instances that take up a majority of the overall bill in the end. So it's really important to try to isolate those. So kind of a summary on this: understand all upfront versus partial upfront versus no upfront is usually a business decision. If you can go all upfront, you'll save about 5% more over no upfront. You'll get about 20% more savings for 3-year over 1 year, but more importantly, 2 years of 1-year plans is about the same as 1 3-year plan for 3 years. So that's important to note, is you're making the decision between 1 year and 3-year plans, and those 3-year plans are significantly more savings than the 1-year plans. And you'll get 7% more savings if you can do an EC2 savings plan over compute. That's a rough number. Also understand, not only is an EC2 plan locking you into instance type, it's also locking you into region. So if you want region flexibility, you'll only get that with compute. And try to isolate the expensive stuff. Spend your time really going for the lowest hanging fruit. I know that's just like our eyes. You can't really get away from that. To get the most savings, you're just going to still have to find where your big cost centers are. So what about spot instances? Many of us remember when spot instance price history pages all look like this. This is one that I found from 2016, where they're all over the place. They're constantly shutting off your instances and reallocating your instances, where spot instances really truly only could be used for certain workloads, and the savings that you would actually get from the spot instances was sometimes pretty hard to predict. If we look at spot instance pricing history today, we see a lot more stable picture, and it makes spot instances actually a lot more appealing in a lot of cases. This stability mixed with the advertised potential saving of up to 90% is really appealing. So you may be asking yourself, how can spot instances really fit into my AWS cost planning? So if we look at our more typical account that was broken down earlier between the EC2 and compute savings plans, and we isolate some easy, low-hanging fruit instances that could be spot instances. So that means our container orchestration worker nodes from both prod and dev. Most tools like Kubernetes have this out of the box, where they have spot instance support and actually handle this really gracefully. And then also we have our Jenkins agents. So if we convert all of these to spot instances from compute 3-year plans, we'll see that these will cost about $2,000 a month. And then if we calculate that back in, our total savings is going to be about 58%. You may remember that our total savings before, without the spot instances, was about 58%. So going from those instances from compute 3-year all up front to spot instances, in our case US East 1, which we'll talk about in a bit, actually didn't really save us anything. It actually cost us about $40 more a month to run spot instances, instead of if we pre-planned with compute 3-year all up front savings plans. But there's a big caveat for this, and this is because it's in US East 1. Spot instance prices range dramatically across regions. So for a theoretical, let's say we ran all of our instances as spot instances in our account. If we start with our on-demand price of a little bit below $31,000, and if all of those instances were to be spot instances in US East 1, we would save about 67%. This is a little bit more than our EC2 3-year all up front. Now, I know this is super unrealistic, but understand you would save about 67% if you just go all spot instances. If we go to US West 2, we would save about 70%. So we're actually saving 3% more just by going to US West 2. And US West 2, just like US East 1, is actually kind of getting pretty crowded too. So if we look at a region that AWS is trying to get a lot of people to move in, you've all probably seen all of the blog posts and different incentives AWS is trying to get people to go to US East 2 or Ohio. Well, if you look at the spot instance prices, it's significantly cheaper. You have a max savings of, if all of your instances were in spots, of 82%. That's 15% higher than spot instances in US East 1. If we look back at our ugly chart of all these different colors, all you need to focus on here is if we change US East 1 and let's say our workload's in US East 2, it's actually a savings of 61%. And just on the spot instances alone, we're saving over $1,000 a month. So if we can convert more things here to spot instances, let's say we can move our Hadoop workers into spot instances, which being such a specialized type of instance, those R5Ns actually have a much higher level of savings than our C5 workers would have. We can get this cost way down with spot instances. I plan to have a whole video just on spot instances and what you can do with auto-scaling groups and the tips and tricks beyond just regional differences, especially around like different instance types and how that applies to spot instances. So please check back in or subscribe if you want to hear more about that. But a summary of all this. At the end of the day, you can be lazy, but if you spend just a little bit of effort, you can save a good amount more money. Overall, you can't forget about spot instances, but they're not always going to be better. That advertised 90% savings max is only for very specific instances and very specific regions. You need to really check the spot instances that you would potentially want to use, and you would have to check the region, and you'd have to check the stability over multiple months. And a lot of times it's just easier to just go with the savings plans and not have to deal with spot instances at all, even if the technologies you're using on those instances can handle the spot instances. And at the end of the day, if you really want the most savings, a lot of the things I presented today was pretty simple and just, isolating a few cost centers. You may not fully get away from spreadsheets. Like, it sucks, it's boring, but savings plans, if you really want to take the most out of them, you might have to really sit down and open up Excel. So yeah, I hope that was informative and gave some new information on the ins and outs of how to use savings plans in the real world, and also sprinkled in a little bit of information about spot instances. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a good day.